In part one of dealing with the Green Man, we talked about how the Green Man was connected to Cernunnos or Cernunnos, the Celtic deity. But now we're going to talk about how Cernunnos or Cernunnos is connected with various other older nature deities as well, and see exactly how widespread this horned nature deity actually is. And that is where we find some truly fascinating details. This fascinating cauldron is also connected to the Indus Valley seals. Thousands of seals found from Indus Valley, but very specifically the Pashupati seal, found in modern Pakistan. This is dating to around 2300 BCE. There are other seals in contrast with this which also have symbols that are later found in Germanic and Celtic cultures. Some of these seals have images nearly identical to runes. There are also symbols of the trinot, swastikas, sun discs, sun wheels, and so forth. But there are also depictions and motifs found later in mythologies, very specifically the horned deity of Cernunnos. This is a horned deity sitting in a yoga-type position surrounded by animals. This is too strong of a connection to ignore. But we also see that this deity has 3 faces, and the number 3 is extremely important in the world of mythology. For instance, the Hindu god or goddess Shiva has 3 faces. Jesus, early on in mystic artistic expression, was depicted as having 3 faces, and of course he was considered part of a trifold. Odin in the Nordic mythologies had 3 brothers. He was one of the 3 modern main deities. There was 3 Norns in the Nordic mythology. We find in the Christian ideology the Holy Trinity and so forth, and there is also the number 3 scattered consistently throughout fairy tales. The number 3 obviously has significant meaning, and archetypically it means the past, present, and future. Now then, the most important and pressing question that I think that we have to ask, are these simply just archetypal images? Common images that appear in a type of 100th monkey syndrome where they're just random images cropped up from the imagination, scattered throughout all cultures? Or do these images have a common connection to a proto-mythological deity? That is a question that we have to seriously ponder, because that is of the utmost significance to understanding the overall image of the Green Man motif. The reality is that these horned nature deities seem to be more than just an archetype. Although they are an archetype, there seems to be a real universal belief in them, that they're part of an evolutionary process to the overall mythologies of human beings. In other words, we see this image so deeply connected that we have to conclude that there must be a proto-mythological root. In other words, it is very closely akin to what has been commonly called the Indo-European mythology. Yet the Indo-European mythology has a lot of miscalculations and misinterpretations about it, and it creates a lot of confusion and it muddies the waters significantly. I like the term proto-mythology because it disregards something that we've now concluded to a specific time and place in concerns to Indo-European mythologies. The Indo-European mythology is significant, albeit it is not necessarily the proto-mythology. Maria Gimbutas concurs with this whenever she's discussing various themes, symbols, and motifs found in history and archaeological finds, when she starts to say that it wasn't the Indo-European people, but it was a proto-Indo-European people, something that was even before them. And that is simply what I like to simply just call proto-mythology. That is where we find the nature deity having its most extensive roots, and that's why we see it to be such a common motif scattered throughout all of history and throughout all of Europe. Long before we see images of Cernunnos, though, we see deities or shamans which are mimicking deities represented in the cave paintings in Lascaux, France. These date to around 13,000 BCE, and they clearly show horned deities or horned shamans of some aspect. This also seems to take on a very psychedelic aspect, a very shamanistic aspect, which of course can be related to the supernatural aspects of the deities,
but there are also countless other relics besides this, which paint vivid pictures of horned deities from the Middle East to the Mediterranean, to Scandinavia, all over northern Africa. They're all sharing these very common images and motifs.
Yet, no matter where we see these images crop up, being in northern Africa or Scandinavia or right in the heart of Europe itself, there are very common themes associated with these images. First of all, there always seems to be a sort of psychedelic or shamanistic aspect to these things. They're very connected with the extra psychical experience, the visionary experience, so to speak. We also see that there are strong affiliations with fertility and sexuality, very specifically male fertility. In fact, Cernunnos or Cernunnos is oftentimes represented with a very large phallus, so it represents male fertility or male fruitfulness, so to speak. But there's also strong affiliations with nature and animals, indicating that these deities or this proto deity is a sort of protector of nature or a sort of defender of the environment, so to speak. And it's very strongly affiliated with certain groves and forests, as pointed out by Fraser in The Golden Bough. And we also see that it has a strong affiliation with death and resurrection, the whole idea of cyclic events in life.
Looking at the shamanistic affiliation to these horned nature deities, though, we see that a very common practice in Europe was the act of mimicking the gods, dressing like the gods or the goddesses, for instance. And in this, the shamans oftentimes wore antlers or horns, and they dressed in foliage or they would dress in animal skins. For instance, if we look at the shaman of Bad Nuremberg, dated to around 6800 BCE, we see that she was adorned with stag or roebuck antlers. Looking at Siberian shamanism, which remained very undefiled for a lot of years, it gives us a very ample example of how these shamans acted, how they dressed, how they looked. And anthropologically speaking, whenever there was a great interest taken in Siberian shamanism, we gain a lot of great historic information from these early anthropologists. We know that they took psychedelics, that they were affiliated with animal transformation, so to speak, that they wore animal skins, that they wore horns and antlers, and their whole practice was extremely nature-oriented.
These horned deities, though, which the shamans were trying to replicate or mimic, are now what we know as, archetypically speaking, the magician. They are the protector of the forest, the shamanistic aspect, which is the embodiment of magic, and they are direct anthropomorphic manifestations of nature and the forces found within nature. Yet these nature deities symbolize something significant. They symbolize aspects of nature. And this is where a lot of people get confused, is they think that there was a literal belief to a lot of the mythologies. They believe that the ancients actually thought that these deities existed, when in actuality they were metaphors, so to speak. They were, for lack of better terms, there were signs which represented forces of nature. So what did these nature deities, such as Cernunnos or the Green Man, actually represent? They represented our human emergence from nature. Before Darwinism, before Christianity, paganism believed that we were manifestations of nature. For instance, look at the Germanic or the Norse aspects, where they believed that we were children of ash and elm, obviously representing the ash and elm tree. So whenever these deities emerged, they were symbolizing our emergence from nature. They were symbolizing our connection to nature. But furthermore, they represented the magical qualities of nature. These deities had extremely mystic and occult-like phenomenon associated with them. They represented mysteries. They represented cycles of life, cycles of nature, cycles of seasons, so to speak. They represented an animalistic quality. They represented instinct. They represented our totem aspects, which were practiced in almost all pre-Christian mythologies. They represented something very human that mirrored ourselves, but more so than just mirroring ourselves, they mirrored an aspect of humanity found within nature. And that is why there was such a strong and profound connection to these nature deities, because they were showing the blurring of the lines between humanity and nature. They were showing the blurring of the lines between where humans begin and where animals begin. And it bridged the gap between the human qualities and the nature qualities.